There's a river somewhere flows through the lives of everyone.
Go, heartbeat of the city, sound of Washington, D.C., old school to new school.
All that's broken on the riverside. Is it a natural state, how it's supposed to be? I think there's something that we just don't see.
Welcome. You are listening to We Act Radio, broadcasting from Nacotchtank land, known now as Washington, D.C. I'm Virginia Avniel Spatz, and I'm joined today by Bethany Young of DC Justice Lab. Community Through COVID began when the pandemic kind of shut down We Act Radio use of our tiny little radio studio, which just wasn't really healthy, and we are still broadcasting from a variety of locations in DC and beyond through the magic of technical magic that allows us to broadcast on We Act Radio. And before we start with today's program and introduce our guest, I want to make sure that everybody knows that We Act Radio will host the first welcoming home party for Sundiata Acoli, who was just released from prison after nearly 50 years in prison. And he was a political prisoner, and you can learn more about him at a website that I will share on the screen momentarily, sundiataacolifc.org. And for this event that will be on Saturday, June 4th at 6 o'clock, you are asked to RSVP to sundiataacolifc at gmail.com. That's sundiataacolifc at gmail.com, or that same beginning.org. And you can find out all the information about this this elder and teacher will be joining. And We Act Radio is really excited to have this chance to welcome him home. And now I am going to add into the stream Bethany Young, who is with DC Justice Lab. And she is deputy director there, a lawyer, researcher, policy expert with experience directing complex multi-state criminal justice research and reform projects. She managed the DC Police Reform Commission, which just issued its report. Well, not just, it's a whole year ago now. We'll talk about that as things come along, advising on police practices and community safety and coordinating development of recommendations to improve safety. That was in DC. And then before joining DC Justice Lab, which is also quite new, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, Bethany worked at the Justice Policy Center at the Urban Institute, where she led a project to examine and improve conditions in several state prisons. She previously served as an attorney at the Center for Death Penalty Litigation and at the Equal Justice Initiative. Her work there focused on capital appeals, and she worked with policymakers on initiatives to reconsider the death penalty and reduce physical and sexual assaults in Alabama Department of Corrections. Bethany earned her BA from Spelman College, a JD from the George Washington University Law School, and a PhD from Duke. And welcome, Bethany. And if you want to add anything, or if I got anything wrong, jump in. And I do want to say just a tiny little bit about the DC Justice Lab before I'll let you explain more about their work. But if I understand right, you haven't even had your second birthday, right? It started in June 2020.
That's right.
And it is a team of law and policy experts researching and organizing and advocating for large-scale changes to the district's criminal legal system. And the goal is evidence-driven, community-rooted, and radically, or I wrote down racially just safety solutions. And as I said, it's not even 2 years old, but has already educated the community in lots of ways. And we're delighted to have the Justice Lab represented and to have Bethany Young. And you heard from her bio that the people who are running DC Justice Lab have a lot of expertise and are really bringing that into the conversation here in DC with the hopes that eventually DC could become kind of a reform model for other places. Right now, we're kind of mired in the not so much, but we're getting there. So before I go any further, I just say hello to our audience. Some people will only be hearing, and let us anything you want to add.
Hi, thank you for having me, Virginia. Really excited to have this conversation with you. And hello, listeners.
Okay, so the thing that I was hoping we could really kind of focus on is actually this idea. It's about focus, because so much of our discussion in DC and around the country is guns this, guns that, police this, police that, and nobody's ending up safe. And in particularly Black and brown people and queer people and disabled people are not being made any safer by these conversations that are going on. And DC Justice Lab, if I understand it right, really wants us to think new, really fresh ways about what is safety. So is that a good place to start? Do you want to start on what is safety?
Yeah. I think the conversation that we have at DC Justice Lab time and time again is the distinction between feeling safe and being safe. Our community and the conversations in DC in particular often stop at feeling safe without going a little further and deeper into what actually creates the state of safety. Feeling safe may include feelings of security. That may include seeing more police on your corners or in your neighborhoods or at the metro station or around your grocery store. But we know from just watching the news, we know from being in those communities that it's not actually creating safety. It may possibly contribute to some people, and not all people, I should say, feeling safe, but it's not actually creating real safety. Real safety is when community members have the resources they need to generate safety on their own. We know that the foundation of true community safety is the community itself. That means that people have food, they have access to healthcare, children have access to productive activities and mentors, that families have what they need to actually be providers, as well as having time to spend with their children and families in the community. It means that everyone has what they need to have not just to survive, but to be thriving. And that's really what generates real safety. We saw over the past couple of years since the Police Reform Commission released its recommendations that we have lots of police on the streets. DC has one of the highest um, police per capita in the country, but yet police are showing up afterwards. I think in particular about the shooting at National Stadium not too long ago, where there were police, I think, across the street or on the corner. They were right there, but the shooting still happened. They were there to respond afterwards, but they didn't prevent it. That it's not a preventative solution. I'm interested to learn more about kind of what their success rate is after the fact in solving crime. But we know they're not creating safety. They're not achieving the end that the community entrusts them and funds them to do. So safety is really a thriving community. That's what breeds safety.
So those are things that at least some of us would agree that is how we create safety, by making a community that supports everybody from the wealthiest to the least wealthy and the most vulnerable. But meanwhile, we do have a criminal justice system that is, at least here in DC, I think I haven't studied the issue. I'm sure you can tell us. at least here in DC, I think it's 90% of the people who enter into the justice system, including kids who are in the juvenile justice system, are Black kids, sometimes brown kids, very few white kids. And as people get older, that statistic doesn't change. So do you want to talk a little bit about I hate to even use the word justice, like, do we have legal system, how our legal system is just kind of already not working to create justice?
Sure. And you have it exactly right, Virginia, that our criminal legal system is almost exclusively Black, almost exclusively poor, and very much focused on the Native population of DC, Black DC natives. Despite being less than half of the population, Black people represent over 80% of police stops. They represent over 90% of the Department of Corrections, and as you mentioned, nearly 100% of the juvenile correction system. And it's not because these individuals or communities are necessarily committing more crimes or creating more trouble in the community. It is because their communities are the focus of an aggressive and sometimes very harmful criminal legal system. These communities are experiencing, displacement as a result of gentrification. They're experiencing over policing, and are disproportionately the brunt of state violence at the hands of law enforcement. And they are at kind of the people who find themselves in the criminal legal system and make it to court, they are being sentenced at higher rates than other racial and ethnic groups. So it's not, this isn't happening in communities that are predominantly white and wealthy. This isn't happening in the communities where there are people who have the access to power and to the ears of policymakers. It's happening in the communities with the least resources and the least access to power. Perhaps I can say a little bit more. Well, maybe there's another question.
If you want to, if you had another thought, please go ahead. If you'd rather that I ask.
No.
So we know that the legal system here in DC disproportionately affects, harms, even terrorizes parts of our community while other people can live. And for those who are listening, or who maybe are not cited, I do want to say I have lived in DC a long time. I am a white woman. I have raised 2 white children here who no longer live here. They're grown adults. My husband is white. I've lived here a long time. My experience of police is different than some of my neighbors has been from the get-go. And for those who are not able to see, Bethany Young is a Black woman, and I don't know how long you've lived in DC, but you can speak to that later. I just want, for the purposes of accessibility and just to make sure that we kind of know, some of the things that we're talking about, that our circumstances can be really different. DC is such a divided place that people who are living, especially if they're living far west of the river and they're living in whiter, wealthier communities, they really don't have any idea what people are talking about when they're talking about jump outs, when they're talking about the police restraining 9-year-old kids on their way home from some activity, and can just think we're living on different planets, even though DC is only 700,000 people. We're a pretty small place compared to, say, like Chicago or LA or someplace like that. So I wanted to just kind of state that. And then I want to say that we've known that for a long time. And DC actually instituted this DC Police Reform Commission, which has been mentioned a few times. And they issued a report with all these recommendations back in April of 2021. And why don't you tell listeners what the DC Council did with all of those recommendations?
Yeah. If I could go back a little bit, and your point about representation is so important, Virginia. I was born in DC and raised in this area between DC and Maryland. Left for a while for school and job and exploring, and found myself back in DC, and was really and really blessed and honored to be able to do this work in a place that matters to me. But your point about how divided DC is well taken. Our policymaking process in DC so often excludes the people who are disproportionately experiencing the brunt of it, right? So these policies that are affecting the daily lives of everyone, but in particular of Black and poor DC residents, aren't really factoring them into the process. And that's one reason that DC Justice Lab was created, because our founder, Patrice Sultan, saw that that the most impacted communities, which are Black natives in DC, were possibly being brought in kind of early in the ideation process, or kind of late in the process to testify, or kind of to be poster children for a particular policy, but are rarely kept in the loop from start to finish. And her goal was bringing together kind of more technical policy making and legal expertise, and bringing it to bear to support the communities in having a voice and bridging that divide between what was happening, in the streets of, for example, Ward 7 or 8, and the policymaking process, and not kind of, touting support or touting community representation or community-driven efforts, but actually doing the work to make that possible. The Police Reform Commission was created, I believe, because the council had a recognition of that the people most impacted and most interested in changing the way we make policy and the way our criminal legal system works were not having a voice, in the ultimate product. The Police Reform Commission was created by the council to research and develop recommendations to reform policing. That was the mandate. The commission quickly, once it was convened and underway, found that it had to be bigger than policing, that to really address this safety, community safety, the commission was going to have to look at a very broad definition of what safety meant and which actors were involved in public safety. So the commission met from September 2020 through April 2021. And that's been and released its ultimately nearly 300-page report with over 90 recommendations. The recommendations covered the gamut. It talked about crisis response, so meeting behavioral health crisis with specialized skill and compassion. It talked about improving the social safety net. It looked at recommendations around police-free schools, about reducing gun violence in our communities, but using community-based measures to do that. Talked about a harm reduction approach to policing. How do we reduce the likelihood and the opportunity for these harmful, sometimes deadly interactions between police and residents of DC, and as well as, in particular, looking at police interactions with youth. How do we reduce those, and when they do happen, how do we make them less harmful and provide more protection to our kids? It looked at kind of the culture of the police department. What are some measures that can be taken to transform the culture of policing? I think we found that that's hard to do, and particularly within an institution that was created to be unjust and to target Black and poor people. And then the final set of recommendations looked at accountability and oversight within the police department. So as I mentioned, nearly a 300-page report. It represents, I think, millions of dollars and thousands of hours, and all of that labor by the commissioners themselves was unpaid. So the 20 people selected to sit on the commission were not paid, but let me tell you, it was hours of meetings every day, Monday through Friday, for 8 months. And the council hasn't passed a single law. They haven't. There have been bills introduced that stem from the Police Reform Commission's report, but not a single law in over a year has been passed, despite this incredible investment in that body.
And I know it's a tall order, but do you have any sense of why these are not moving forward? Is it that the public is not consistently up in arms? Is it just inertia? Is it money from the police union? Any ideas?
My best answer is politics. The lawmakers are, for better or worse, kind of having to play the political game, and so that means hesitance to act or to move without consensus in a community about what measures they're willing to support. Um, it means that a lot of things that had a lot of energy behind them 2 years ago, that with facing the news and the emphasis on violent crime by the news media, it means that's chilled some of the action and energy behind these things, not just from lawmakers, but community members as well. It's across the board had a chilling effect on the momentum we had going into the commission and coming out of the commission. Um, I think there is some political fear that kind of taking too hard a stance or kind of doing something transformative is not going to be well received politically. And we're in an election season, and that has some consequences for the types of things that lawmakers who are politicians are willing to do. Excuse me. That could risk their political careers. I think there's a desire to please everyone. There's um, less willingness, when there are loud voices in opposition to certain measures. The police union being one of those voices and a loud voice. And that has led to the inaction that we've seen over the last year.
So one of the things that one of the things that I wanted to make sure that we did discuss is that we are in the middle of an election season here in DC, and police and policing and crime has been an issue from even before people started to declare last fall. And it it comes up in the mayor's race, it comes up in the attorney general's race, it comes up in every one of the races, and we have incumbents who are saying that they have certain stances about police and policing, but we don't have any, as you said, we don't have a record of actual legislation coming through. And there's always, is it the right time for this particular piece? Can we get it through? Are we burning our political capital? But we had so many hearings like 2 years ago. That's how the Police Reform Commission was a result, I'm pretty sure, of all the people who came and said,
Yeah.
our criminal system is broken and it's harming people all the time and you need to do something. 16,000 pieces of testimony and then zero, zip, zilch, nothing. But meanwhile, Charles Allen, who is my own council person, Ward 6, and the chair of the Judiciary Committee, is getting ripped up by the police union and by a lot of other people who say, he's trying to defund the police when he hasn't voted for anything like that. So even, I don't know, it's almost like even if you think you want to think differently, people attack you. And yet there actually is no record. So it's a sadly ironic situation that we're in. And you could just comment on that, but I don't know if that's really helpful. I'm kind of rambling. What I really want to ask is what do we do as citizens who are trying to vote? What can we base our hopes on when we don't actually have a record from anybody that they've supported real reform? You have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I have to, and I will put an asterisk next to what I said earlier. One vote that was encouraging recently was the vote to maintain um, their commitment that many council members made last year to get police out of schools and to invest more in alternatives, particularly school-based mental health in schools, and to invest more in our poorest, most under-resourced schools. And I think that is a statement to the credit of the council members that did stand behind it, of their commitment to transformative justice. What do I say to voters in DC who are thinking about how do I know where this person stands in terms of safety? I don't have a good answer for the past year because, as you mentioned, outside of the budget vote around police free schools and council members' decision not to increase funding for certain recruitment measures that the mayor proposed. Um, well, I think those are, some things that people can look at. Did you stand by your commitment to take police out of schools? I think that's a big one. Um, and did you stand by your commitment to not drastically increase police spending? That's another big one. But look at what council members are doing. If we think about safety broadly, what are they doing about schools? What are they doing about healthcare? What are they doing about housing? About the environment? These are all things that are tied to safety and health, and community health, and those are also important. Um, Thinking about the things, the factors, the influences outside of the traditional legal system that are also inputs into whether communities are overall safe and healthy. I think those are um, kind of decision measures that voters can look to.
Okay, thank you. That is very helpful, and the refocusing away from a few dollars in the budget about police is really important. I think it is. I find myself, even though I'm trying really hard, I get really sucked into, back and forth about one particular little thing without that big picture. So I appreciate you, centering our attention, or broadening it. And I also, one thing I want to mention is that I have no legal training, and when I first learned about DC Justice Lab, I was so impressed that Patrice Sultan actually knew how to write legislation, and that the people who were involved actually know how a bill should really look, not just we have to get rid of guns, or some slogany thing. And I know that you have, along with Harriet's Wildest Dreams, and I'm not sure who the other partners are, the Safe and Free DC, which is very specific bits of legislation that we would hope, and a lot of them come out of the Reform Commission. So can you speak a little bit to that campaign and how that works?
Yeah, so we, along with Harriet's Wildest Dreams and the National Reentry Net for Returning Citizens, published our Solutions for a Safe and Free DC, and folks can take a look at it at safeandfreedc.com. And it was kind of the embodiment of our mission is we want to propose this slate of policies that's going to make us safer, and that comes from the most impacted people who are Black Native Washingtonians. And the policy agenda, the Black-led policy agenda, is supported by I think close to 20 Black-led organizations and other white-led organizations as well. And we have over 100 at last count individuals sign-ons in support of the agenda. And the goal was kind of thinking about, as I said earlier, safety in the true meaning of the word. What are the policies that are going to get us there, that we have already well researched and documented support for, that the council can act on today? They could have acted on it yesterday. And so the agenda includes a total of 18 proposals, 9 of which are bills that are already before the council that have already been introduced, and 9 of which have yet to be introduced. And they cover a range of things, from kind of decriminalizing poverty to providing protections for youth, addressing the history of racial injustice in the city, as well as present day practices which unjustly and disproportionately harm Black people. Measures that ensure police aren't needlessly intervening in situations that don't present an immediate threat to public safety and often create more danger. Measures that would strengthen independent oversight of police, that would improve transparency, ending qualified immunity. Measures that would address mass incarceration and torturous conditions in the DC jail. One of the things that we don't always get an opportunity to talk about, but that's happening, under our noses in DC, is the use of solitary confinement, which the United Nations has defined as torture. But that is a practice that the DC Department of Corrections has many names that they use, but it's solitary confinement, and it's an inhumane practice that's taking place in our jail and also in the youth facility in DC. And kind of the final set of measures that the policy agenda includes is in support of an overhaul of the current record sealing process in DC, and measures like that are really crucial to public safety, because one of the factors that we know prevents recidivism for people who are returning home from periods of incarceration are access to housing and stable employment, and those are things which a criminal record often blocks people from achieving.
So all of those bills are at safeandfreedc.com, and please do look them up. You can find more information. And since we're at the bottom of the hour, I'll just remind listeners, this is We Act Radio, broadcasting from historic Anacostia, Washington, D.C. You're listening to Bethany Young, who is Deputy Director, DC Justice Lab, and I'm your host, Virginia Avniel Spatz. And I want to go back to this idea of not those of us who are not legal experts. And I'm not sure, this is a little bit beyond DC jurisdiction, but there's a lot of things that are called reform that turn up. Like our president made a big statement a couple days ago about reform finally, for police. And how do, I mean, if you want to just comment on that, that's fine. But I'm wondering, how do people who are not experts, and we are going to be on the radio, so I don't want to use an expression that's, how do you cut through the foolishness and lies and obfuscation, we'll say? How do we know if these bills are actually going to do anything?
That's a really good question, Virginia. I think, to just talk about the executive order briefly, um, I think it was partly a symbolic gesture, which, I won't say that there's no value to that, because I think it is an important thing for politicians, in particular politicians at the national level, to express their commitment to changing the way that things are, to changing the status quo. And the executive order, I think, demonstrates a commitment some commitment to doing that. I know that it is not as far as President Biden said he would go on the campaign trail. I think he got a little gun shy, for probably a really terrible choice of words, excuse me, um, in terms of the length of the measures that he expressed willingness to take when he was campaigning for office versus what ended up in the executive order. In particular, the the changes that were included around solitary confinement had a lot less teeth and a lot less force than what he promised. He promised, I believe, to get rid of solitary confinement in federal prisons, and that didn't happen. Um, how do folks cut through the foolishness, the malarkey? I would say my suggestion would be, and DC is unique in that there are a lot of organizations committed to kind of bridging that divide and providing resources and materials that are easier to understand than kind of looking at the text of a bill. That's something that is a really difficult thing to do, not just to write it, but to even understand what any of it means. But to the extent that this exists in your communities, I would suggest that people find organizations and advocates they trust. I know in DC in particular, there are a lot of coalitions that have a track record of challenging the status quo and of challenging lawmakers and policymakers, to listen to the demands of community, and that are committed and invest in resources so that people understand what exactly is our system doing, what exactly are policymakers doing. So finding those organizations, tapping in, and asking questions. I think it is the responsibility of your lawmakers wherever you are to make sure that you have access to and are able to understand the things that they're doing. And I would suggest that people reach out directly to those people, to those offices, and ask, I don't really understand what this bill is doing. Can you explain it to me? And policymakers and decision makers are busy people, but they were put into office by you, so they are beholden to you, and they owe it to their communities to be transparent, and accessible in explaining and talking about the decisions they're making that affect those communities. And that's and one thing that is really wonderful on some days about the age we're living in is that we have more access to people. There are a lot of different channels that folks can use to communicate with one another, social media being one of them. And policymakers, lawmakers, the DC Council here in the district, are they're watching those things. You can talk to people that way. And especially in an election season, they are particularly eager to communicate with people and to provide answers. So I would take advantage of those opportunities.
And of course, the materials that you mentioned earlier, the safeandfreedc.com. And I do encourage listeners and everyone who gets a chance to take a look at that. Even if you're not in DC, I think it might be helpful because as we're talking, the more people who are not really familiar with how laws work get a chance to look at things that are explained by people who actually care that we understand it and can promote it, can advocate for what we want. That is like practice that actually makes it a little bit easier than to go talk to your council member because you've already read some sample background about the legislation and you're not just coming into it completely cold. And and we have mentioned a few times that DC is kind of a peculiar place in that we can pass legislation and have Congress overturn it. We can pass legislation and have Congress refuse to fund it. All kinds of things happen here. But the positive part of that is there are a lot of advocacy organizations and people can join up with them and educate themselves. And I do want, before we kind of end our conversation, I do want to ask, how can people work on this idea of re-envisioning what safety is and really promote that when we have so much fear, so much anger, so much of 400 years of history just coming down on us all in one tweet. How can we continue to advocate for that picture when our situation is so tricky?
Yeah. Before I answer that, I want to talk about DC in particular, and for folks wanting to look at their potential elected officials and current elected officials' record on some of the measures that I've talked about in safeandfreedc.com. If you go there and measure by measure, you can see on each page where your council member stands on a particular issue and what action they have taken or not taken in support or against the measures that DC Justice Lab and our partners have put forward as improving public safety. So once you go there, there are tables on each page that show you what action council has taken by individual council member. And to your last question about what can people do to advocate for sweeping change to our community in ways that will actually achieve safety. I think the big issues to me when it comes to what often gets excluded from the conversation about safety are, basic life resources and access to things that that many of us take for granted as having access to, but really do um, have a lot to do with the state of safety in our communities. Housing and homelessness. What are the supports in your community for unhoused neighbors or people experiencing housing insecurity? How are we treating children? Education, school is one thing, but outside of the school context and within the school context, what resources and supports do we have in place for kids? Healthcare, individuals who are experiencing medical issues, but as well as mental health and behavioral issues, substance abuse disorders. What are the supports that are available and accessible to people experiencing those kinds of crises? what is the social safety net? That's a term that we use often. Kind of what are the things in place that are keeping people, from kind of hitting the bottom? What's protecting folks? And those are the things that are really critical in our efforts to improve safety for everybody.
Well, and I realize we've gone a little bit over the time we had scheduled, but if you have time, I would like to ask about one kind of the flip side, I think, of what you just said about providing supports for a community in terms of education and environment and all the things that we need. One of the things that I think might not be well understood by the general population is kind of exemplified in some of these bills. I'm looking at the list of bills that the council has not moved on. The idea of decriminalizing street vending and the clean hands certification, which means that you can't get certain kind of permits if you happen to owe money on a parking ticket or something like that. These are things that if you are privileged enough to have solid income and never went into one of those situations, you might not know how this is problematic. Can you say a little about those?
Yeah, and so one of the things that we know improves safety and kind of strengthens communities is that people have access to gainful employment, that they can support their families. So the Street Vending Decriminalization Amendment Act, which has been introduced, but has set um, since it's been introduced, would make it so that people who earn their living by selling water bottles or flowers, or kids who are selling snacks on the street, aren't at risk of dangerous interactions with police, and then ultimately criminalization for doing what puts food on their family's table. The Clean Hands Act is another measure that in DC, you're at risk of losing your driver's license and other licenses, professional licenses included, if you have certain debt. That could be an unpaid water bill. That could be an out of state parking ticket. These are things that, if are on someone's record, could prevent them um, from renewing their license before they're able to pay that kind of debt. And that's another thing that, needlessly, it's not something that's actually improving traffic safety or safety at all, but it is blocking poor people in particular from having access to the things they need, including driver's licenses, which will allow them to provide for their families, to get to a job, to move around freely. But we've placed this obstacle in their way because of really insignificant um, debt, um, unpaid debt. That's not really. It says nothing about them being a threat to public safety. These aren't things that actually have that meaning, but they are an obstacle, a needless and unnecessary obstacle to people being able to support themselves and their families.
Well, thank you so much. And I have put the website for DC Justice Lab, DCJusticelab.org, up for people to go and find out more. Also, I will mention again that there is safeandfreedc.com, which, as Bethany was explaining to us, does have these charts that show how sitting council members have voted or not voted and what has happened to the bills. And I do recommend it, just if you're the least bit curious, and of course you should be the least bit curious, to find out about how our bills are written and how they get through and how they don't get through, and then start working on trying to pin our various candidates down so that we get the kind of legislators that, and administrators that we need, so that we can have a safe and free district and maybe become a model for other places. And I want to ask Bethany, do you have any final remarks or any topic that I didn't raise?
No, thank you for having this conversation. I would just again, encourage folks to take a look at safeandfreedc.com, see what your council member has done or not done. And if if it's unsatisfactory to you, let them know. Tell them what you want to happen. Tell them to pass these bills, and to really start working towards a truly safe DC.
Okay, and I will, we've shared a lot of different email addresses and websites. You can always get all of this at communitythroughcovid.com, which is the website for this radio show. I'll put all of the links up very shortly. And one of them, it occurs to me that I will also put up, is from the February program, which was so instructive on Safe and Free DC, that the video is still available. All of the materials are still there. And sadly, most things have not moved since February. And so there's still all of that to learn and get involved with. And so, I will say again, thank you, Bethany Young, DC Justice Lab, for this really informative conversation. And I'm always trying to look for a little bit of hope, because it is so hard these days. And these are things we could do. We might be tired. We might be, kind of just soul weary, but these are things we can do. So we can all, get out there and do that. And I will actually let Bethany go now. I have a few more announcements, but I don't want to hold her up all day. She's already stuck with us past our agreed time, which we're really, really grateful for, and hope that, maybe you can come back when we have had success somewhere. We've had success. I don't want to say that. DC Justice Lab has taught us all a lot of things, and I'm grateful for that. So I thank you. And this is We Act Radio from historic Anacostia, Washington, D.C. I'm Virginia Avniel Spatz, and you've been listening to Bethany Young. And I did want to close out with just a few announcements. And so I am going to wish Bethany a good day. So the last couple of announcements, I want to return to saying that this Saturday, June 4th at 6 o'clock, We Act Radio is hosting the first welcoming party for Sundiata Acoli, who was just very recently released from nearly 50 years in prison. Political prisoner Sundiata Acoli. You can learn more about him and the campaign to get him home at sundiataacolifc.org. I'll put that on the screen here again. And to RSVP for the event on Saturday, you can email sundiataacolifc@gmail.com. And as I said earlier, all of this information will be on the communitythroughcovid.com website. And there'll be links to the DC Justice Lab, to this event, to all of the things that were mentioned. And in the last couple of minutes before signing off, I do want to mention that on June 1st, the National Park Service has announced that tomorrow they're going to start clearing tent encampments near Union Station in Washington, D.C. A lot of Washington, D.C. parkland, or doesn't necessarily have to really look like a park. A lot of our land is actually under the jurisdiction of the National Park Service, and they are moving people who have been living in tents without making arrangements for these people to have ongoing support or places to move. Sometimes when the city moves people from encampments, there is some effort made to offer and arrange housing for people before the encampment is cleared out. In this case, apparently that is not happening. And I don't have further information about that right now. We Act Radio will share what we do have as it becomes available, but I wanted to make sure that everybody knows that here in the district, on land that is controlled by the National Park Service. Some of our neighbors will be forcibly removed tomorrow, June 1st. And our mayor and our city council are not intervening in any way, whether they actually would be able to be successful or not. They are not intervening. So please keep your eye on that situation, and stay tuned to We Act Radio on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all the social media to follow that story and others. And you will be able to share this recording shortly after we end the broadcast. So again, Virginia Avniel Spatz for We Act Radio, broadcasting from historic Anacostia, Washington, D.C., wishing everyone peace in a difficult time.